Good day, ladies and gents. I am really looking forward to this episode of We're Talking Shift because today's show will focus on financial health, security, and sovereignty. So, yes, I thought it was time to dig into some of the fundamentals of Bitcoin and why it may be in your best interest to gain a better understanding of it. Our tour guide through this adventure is the very lovely and quite brilliant Natalie Brunell. Now, those of you who are not new to the world of Bitcoin are most certainly already familiar with Natalie. But for those of you who are new to this space, allow me to tell you just a little bit about her. Now, Natalie is a prominent podcast host, educator, and media commentator focused on Bitcoin education and financial literacy, which I think a lot of us could use a lot more of. Her popular show, Coin Stories, features investing news updates and thought-provoking interviews with international thought leaders on topics related to finance, to global economics, and technology. Now, Coin Stories is the #1 woman-hosted show in the Bitcoin genre. It ranks top 20 in Apple Podcast Business News and averages more than 1 million views and audio downloads monthly. Previously, Natalie was an award-winning television journalist and investigative reporter. For more than 10 years, she covered in-depth local and national news topics and holds a regional news Emmy for breaking news coverage. Natalie was also recently an adjunct professor of advanced communication and visual storytelling at the University of Southern California. She is a first-generation immigrant from Poland and holds a Master's of Science in Journalism from Northwestern University. Natalie, welcome to We're Talking Shift.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
I am too. This is something that I haven't really dove into any aspects of financial health and wellness with my audience. And it's really been calling to me to start doing a little more of that because We're Talking Shift is all about all aspects of health, whether it's your mental health, your emotional health, the health of your relationships. Everything boils down to how healthy is that aspect of your life. And financial health is a big one. And you know better than anyone that things they have been a-changing and not necessarily for the better for most people. There's still, although I think most people now have heard that word and heard that concept, Bitcoin, but I think, and you know this better than I do, I think there's more people that don't understand it than do. And so we're still in the relatively early stages of this whole thing of Bitcoin. And so I just really wanted to have somebody that is so good at really explaining just some of the fundamentals and why you want to pay attention and where things might be going. So you are the one, lady. You're the one.
Thank you. I'm very honored.
Thank you. So, listen, you obviously had a very impressive journalism background and were doing great things, very successful. And so, how and why did you make this leap from that to becoming a Bitcoin advocate?
Sure. It's a great question. And I think my media background has really prepared me for this role, conducting interviews and doing Bitcoin education and speaking on camera in a way that the average person can really understand because my background is really storytelling. The reason that I transitioned into this new career field, it was accidental passion project that turned into something a whole lot more that I didn't expect. But it was really because I knew that there was a problem. And for 10 years, I was reporting on the symptoms of the problem. And what do I mean by that? I was reporting on how the average person was struggling with the cost of living, healthcare costs were skyrocketing, there was more public corruption, there was more crime, people couldn't afford things like education. And I saw that the nation was getting more and more divided. So it's actually interesting that in the middle of this whole journey of my reporting was the 2016 election, where I swear it was like a civil war that was breaking out, and even family members could no longer talk to each other because they were on different political teams. And I honestly grew up not really knowing whether someone voted one way or another. I felt like I grew up in maybe even the golden age of American life where people seem to still really be good to one another and they could be friends despite different views. And they just wanted to work hard to provide for their families. And the American dream felt like it was in reach. I know that I went off to college thinking that if I just work hard, I get my degree, and then I go off and I pursue a career, I'll be able to afford a home and a family and retirement someday. And as I got older and as I was working as a journalist, I realized that dream is becoming further and further out of reach. And the goalpost keeps moving, and people's wages are not keeping up with the price of the things that really matter, like education and healthcare and the cost of living. And so I started to wonder what's going on, what's under the surface. Maybe that was some of my investigative background. And I think that I fell for the same fallacies and the same temptations that so many people do today, where I thought, oh, it's clearly the greedy and the big corporations, the wealthy, who are to blame, who are stealing from us, the poor. And so we need to tax them and then redistribute the wealth.
Yeah.
I fell completely for that. So I understand where that sentiment comes from. But what I was humbled by is when I learned about Bitcoin, I realized I did not know what money is. I
Mhm.
didn't know the history of money. I didn't understand how our banking industry works, what fractional reserve banking is, and what money printing actually is. I thought it was the physical printing of dollars. And
Yes.
so I had to go on this journey of discovery. And ultimately, when I learned about Bitcoin, I felt like it was the thing that we most need to fix these very pressing issues that I had been reporting on. And I want to channel my focus and my energy there so that I can hopefully help bring us into this new transition and into this new sort of economic system that is more fair and provides more opportunity for the majority of people.
Yeah, yeah, it's so interesting. So many of those things I can completely relate to them. I have the same general feelings. And why is printing money bad? It's if you don't have a
Yeah.
financial education, if you don't, and even that, you really got to start digging to get to the bottom of things. And it's a continual learning process about what exactly is inflation, because people treat it like it's this sort of beast that's come out of of a cave somewhere, and now it's ravaging the country, and somebody's got to come and save us from this beast. And there's this weird disconnect. But yes, but how did that beast get created, and why does it seem to keep growing, and how does that relate to one's own personal sense of financial sovereignty? And so I'll tell you what, the learning curve, it never ends. It was only a few months ago where I read The Creature from Jekyll Island,
Oh,
and
yeah.
I was all of a sudden going, holy crap, what the heck is this? All of these things that my mind was blown wide open with, just the complicated web that has been woven around our money and what it is and how it's working for some and
Mhm.
almost always working against others is
Yeah.
pretty fascinating. So you really have to have a pretty hungry drive to figure out how to manage this thing that we all depend on for our well-being in so many ways. All right, you already answered my next question, is why you decided to make this leap and what you knew about money, which relatively speaking wasn't really a lot, because when you're young you only know what you know, which is my parents go to work, they make money, and then you buy things with it. And beyond that, you don't really think much about it until you start to work yourself, and then you're paying some taxes, and and then you just rinse and repeat. So how then did you end up learning? Because Bitcoin is, to somebody that's never really taken a deep dive into anything in that realm, technology, money, just the whole thing, how did you learn about it initially that caused you to be able to, something in your mind clicked and you went, oh, I get that now, I get it, and I'm going deep into this? What was that first step that caught you?
Yeah, absolutely. Learning about Bitcoin is a very big rabbit hole. It's a very rewarding one, but it can be really intimidating at the start. And I always try to hold off on really telling someone about Bitcoin before I really help educate them or lead them down the path to learning about the history of money. Because to your earlier points about the lack of financial literacy that exists, I think it's devastating actually to the economic health of a country for people to not understand how the financial system actually works and to not understand the history of how we got to a place where we are printing infinite amounts of units and essentially impoverishing future generations, which we are seeing the consequences play out right now because young people, I think, are in the worst position ever. And we have generations now that are worse off than the one that came before, despite being better educated and having better technology. But it's because of this system that essentially at its core is designed to oppress the average working person. And so I really had to unpack a lot of economic knowledge and theory. And so my first book that I really highly recommend for everyone is The Bitcoin Standard. And I resisted the book at first because, again, I was intimidated by Bitcoin. And to be really honest with you, I thought, oh, this is a book about computer programming or something very techie. And I'm not a techie person. I don't want to read about programming, computer science. And that was my first mistake because the book is actually like 10 chapters about the history of money and maybe one or two chapters about Bitcoin. And when I started to learn about the history of money, which really is a history of us as people and how we relate to one another and the history of human action, I was just enthralled. I was sitting on the edge of my seat because I think we learn in school about history through the context of, let's say, wars and battles and kingdoms and empires, but the money is essentially what allowed for many of them to rise or ultimately to fall because of the blunders they made that we tend to repeat because many of us ignore history.
Yeah.
So I think you really have to take that first step. And the best way to really learn is to understand the history of money. And like you're reading about the history of our central bank, which so many of us are not taught. Again, the fact that these actors came together to create this centralized force that has so much power and can literally decide the cost of borrowing money and the cost of capital today. And they can artificially lower interest rates. And we literally wait with bated breath for what one man will decide to do with interest rates and money, which is wild. And the founding fathers of our country, which again, we were a beacon, we were the source of economic strength that everyone looked to around the world. And it was the backbone of this pillar of freedom, property rights, as well as decentralization that is so core to the founding of this country that allowed for so many people to come here and have opportunity that they never had before and essentially create and determine their own destiny and build wealth. And we've lost a lot of that because it's been captured by special interest groups and by political forces. And so I think it's really critical to learn about this because going to my earlier question, people are turning to politics today, and it's not about politics. It's really because politics should not be in money at all, and money should be separated from the state. And that's really at the core of why Bitcoin was designed.
So interesting because you're right. The government has it's infiltrated all of the main aspects that are the fabric of our lives here. Besides the money, the banks, the education system, everything, there's nothing that seems to be that's a core part of everyone's life and opportunity here. Everything has been funneled into some aspect of government management, which, as we all
Mhm.
know, is not really that efficient, to put it mildly, and
Well, and
certainly doesn't seem to have our best interest at heart.
And what's sad is it's really people are all fallible and there are good people and bad people. And for the most part, I actually think a lot of people are very well-meaning who go to serve
Sure.
in government. But the problem is the system is so broken with corrupted incentives that even the most well-intentioned person could end up doing things that are very detrimental to their constituents that voted for them. Because again, the system is designed essentially to rob people without their knowledge. Inflation is a tax that none of us voted for, and it's what keeps our system going. And there's no accountability because public servants, if they pass a bill or money gets wasted, which we see in states across the country, nothing really happens. They get reelected and their special interest groups keep them in office and keep their donor pockets liquidate or liquid. I think that until we better understand the system, we will not be able to fix it. And thank goodness for something like Bitcoin, because once people understand really what the problem is and they go looking for a solution, it's much easier to determine why Bitcoin is the best solution out there to potentially address a lot of these issues.
Yeah, that's such a good point, which is perfect for my next question. So, how, if you can, in a summary, how in your mind does Bitcoin equal freedom? Because to everything you just said, it's like people are like, I don't have any power to change all of this stuff. What do I do? How do I, which was my whole question that got me going down this path was how, seeing the craziness that's going on, what do we do to be as invulnerable to all
Mhm.
of this? It's like you can see it. It's like you can see the wagon train going toward the cliff. How do we
Yeah.
get off the wagon train? How do we make sure that we don't go over this cliff that it appears that we're going? I don't know how long a country can continue on this path of kicking the
Mhm.
can down the road and continuing to inflate and continuing to print money like it's freaking monopoly money.
Right.
That's about how valid it is anymore. So what do you do? And so that, yeah, for you, the question then really becomes, how do I not become enslaved to this
Mhm.
madness? How does Bitcoin equal freedom in that sense?
Yeah, it's a really important question. And I think it starts with having to understand that the money that you hold in the bank, it doesn't actually exist. It certainly doesn't exist in most places in physical form anymore. It's not in the reserves of the bank. I think a lot of people have this false notion that when they see $100 in their bank account online or 1,000 or whatever, that it's sitting somewhere at the bank and you
Right.
could walk in and at any time take it out. A lot of these banks have maybe a single digit percentage point of the money that if everyone were to call upon that bank, they need to actually honor those deposits and withdrawals,
Right. So that's the
which is
fractional reserve banking you're
Mhm.
talking about, correct?
Yeah, so that in and of itself, I think we live in a country that is the wealthiest, most powerful country in the world. But if all of us today went to our banks and we just asked for the money that we fairly earned doing whatever industry people are watching this and work in, you fairly earned, you expended your energy for that value, for that money. And if all of us together went to the bank, they would not be able to honor those withdrawals and hand us all the money because it doesn't exist. Most of it is just digits on an electrical ledger, basically. Once you understand that there's essentially an intermediary that could tell you, you cannot withdraw this money, it's not actually yours. That starts to set in this reality that I want to own something that is a bearer instrument that no one can take from me. And prior to this digital world that we live in, I would argue that most people relied on gold for that kind of security and freedom and independence because no one can necessarily walk into your home and confiscate all your gold, right? You could potentially protect yourself and defend yourself. But in a digital world where most of us have these electronic ledgers at retail banks, how do you protect yourself? Do you try to go get a bunch of cash from the ATM? And again, they might not honor it over a certain amount. So Bitcoin kind of solves this in a very unique way because it's a digital ledger, it's a digital currency. You don't have to physically hold anything. You can memorize 12 words in your mind. And you can carry your entire wealth with you wherever you go. It is yours. There is no intermediary unless you decide to trust one. So you can give your Bitcoin keys to, say, an exchange or a bank, and they can hold it for you or custody it for you. We don't recommend that. If you just take a few extra steps to learn how easy it is to self custody, we all recommend that. But essentially, if you do take self custody, you are self sovereign. That money is no one's liability. It is no one's property except for yours. And I think that's incredibly empowering because we are lucky to live in a place where Hopefully there are no bank runs tomorrow, although we've seen some recently. We've seen Silicon Valley Bank where
Mhm.
people are lining up trying to get their money before it ultimately collapsed. But in foreign countries, people deal with this on a daily basis. They see their currencies debased 50%, their entire savings just evaporated because someone in a political office decided to devalue the currency and print so much more money. We've seen bank runs in other countries. So you never know. It could happen here too. And we're slowly moving toward that. So Bitcoin is this beautiful way to have a digital bearer instrument that you own and you self custody that is no one else's responsibility or liability.
I love that. Yeah, because it has happened, it continues to happen, and it can happen like overnight. You think you have time to prepare and put measures in place and set up all of these, all of these things. And we have such a false sense of security, I think, in that way here, because our country's it's always been that
Yeah.
shining city on a hill, and everything is possible here, and you have all of these opportunities and freedoms, and things are eroding so much that it's almost now, it's a little delusional to assume that you can trust the powers that be with handling anything financial.
Mhm.
So you have to, I think you really do have to take some steps to figure out, what can I do to protect myself? So what would you say are a couple or the most common misunderstanding about Bitcoin that you run into?
Oh, there are a lot. First of all, people think that you have to own an entire Bitcoin or you have to buy an entire Bitcoin
Yeah.
for it to even make any difference in your life. And that's absolutely not true. You can buy a fraction of a Bitcoin. In fact, on a daily basis, I know that I'm going to spend some amount of dollars on, say, a coffee or maybe a meal. And every single day, I spend at least $5 just buying Bitcoin because I want a dollar cost average. I don't care what the price is because over the course of the year, it averages out to my DCA. But I think it's just important to just slowly accumulate and have that pattern and habit of saving money because so
Hmm.
many of us don't save. And it does make a difference because Bitcoin is the best performing asset of the last decade. So I even surprised my mom because my mom has always been a hard money bug. She grew up in a communist country, so she always turned to gold as her hard money of choice. But when I taught her about Bitcoin, she was very curious, but she was a little nervous about it because of its digital nature. And I helped her set up a DCA account and she just deposited a little bit every single week. Again, something that you might spend on a meal.
Hmm.
And over the course of a year passed, and she looked at the account and she couldn't believe how much it had appreciated because Bitcoin was up 70%. So the same amount of money that would have maybe gained like 7 to 10, maybe 20% in some passive stock index or gained 0.02% in your Chase account or whatever,
Hmm.
it went up 70%. And so she was really impressed by it. And so I just urge people to remember that you can buy fractions of a Bitcoin. That is a huge one for people that are just starting out. They see this big price tag on one Bitcoin and they think that they're too late. Another one is the energy component. Energy is extremely critical to Bitcoin. And I think people, they don't understand how much energy around the world is actually wasted or stranded. And so it's negatively priced, it's not used, or it goes into our atmosphere in something like methane emissions. And Bitcoin, because the miners are location agnostic, they can literally go to anywhere on the planet where there is excess or stranded or wasted energy, and they can gobble that up in order to help secure the Bitcoin network. And I just think that is so incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
I think it will help build out more infrastructure because where there's energy, there is civilization and life and jobs and productivity and opportunity. So we really need to harness technologies that encourage energy infrastructure to be built. And I'm very inspired by the fact that a lot of Bitcoin mining is actually done very sustainably with low emissions. If that's something that some people are very passionate about that movement, and Bitcoin certainly answers that. And another is that it's used for nefarious activities. You could say that about anything. And the dollar is used for more nefarious, illicit financial activities than any other currency. So I think
Yeah.
that is a moot point anyway.
Yeah, that's a joke for sure. That's funny. That's a really good point about the energy too, because I think you're right. So many people are don't understand that this is such a vital component to this. It's like the this could be the gold standard of really effective and efficient and smart recycling by
Yeah.
using this energy. Right now, people think they're recycling their plastics and stuff, and eh, I think a lot of it is just pointless, to be honest with you. But that is something that has immense value, and everyone can benefit in so many ways from it. So you mentioned your mom. Let's talk about women in Bitcoin, because clearly anyone that decides, okay, I'm going to start learning and see who's talking about Bitcoin, and they start Googling, and it's predominantly a sea of men, which is awesome. And you're one of the few women that have really risen to the top in that genre. So how are you thinking about bringing more women into the space? Is that, I think it's probably a passion for you. How do you want women to understand why it's so important for them to also be starting to become Bitcoin savvy?
Yeah, it's a huge passion of mine and a mission of mine to get more women into the space. Because if you look at the globe, 50% are women, but when you look at the Bitcoin space, it's probably 80 to 90% men. And
Yeah.
I'll just share a narrative because I didn't really know this when I was just learning about Bitcoin. I was getting knowledge from all different types of sources. And I guess I didn't really think about the fact that most of the sources, authors, podcast hosts were men. I was just focused on the information. But I went to my first Bitcoin conference in 2021 in Miami. I recruited a girlfriend of mine to just come with me for company. And we were just shocked because we walked into a venue of over 20,000 people and were hard pressed to find another woman. It was very
Wow.
few and far between. A funny side note, it was very convenient when it came time to use the restroom because there was a line for the men's restroom, which I had never seen before. And
Right.
there was nothing. You could easily go use the women's restroom, which it's usually the opposite, right?
Yeah, always.
And it made me sad, if I'm being honest, because
Mhm.
I've always loved spending time with other women. I'm very close with my mom. I think women are brilliant. They're hardworking. A lot of women are out earning men today. They have higher educations than men today. And so for them to be not represented in this movement for financial empowerment and independence was mind-boggling to me. I had no idea why it was so disproportionately dominated by men. And then I thought about it a little bit. And what makes a little bit more sense to me when you think about it is Bitcoin brings together engineering, it brings together finance, it brings together computer programming, computer science, these fields that are extremely male dominated.
Sure.
But what it really needs is the communicators, the storytellers, the nurturers, the people that are more about community, which I think women do an amazing job at. I think that's like our innate natural
Yeah.
gift that we have, is to bring people together and to focus really on people as opposed to just things. I really
Right.
think that's one of the most beautiful things about women. And so I wanted to encourage more women. And I think the only way to do that is to show them that we are in the space and that it's easy to learn and you can be a part of it, and it's extremely empowering, and it's something they don't want to be behind on or come to the train late. So it's a huge
Yeah.
mission of mine, and we have an annual Bitcoin women's brunch that we put on. The next one is July 25th at the Bitcoin conference in Nashville. We're expecting it to double in size.
I
So
will
I
be
hope
there.
that everyone checks it out. I can provide a link for you and they can get a discount to the conference. And then the women's event is always free. I do not want it to be a paid event.
I love that. I will be there, and we will absolutely share that link too.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that about just all of this about women, because I was actually I read an article in Forbes that came out last month, and it was citing a study, I'm going to read it here, that showed women are increasingly playing a pivotal role in the household financial decision
Yeah.
making. And that this was interesting, and that by 2030, women will be the primary holder of wealth in the United States, as reported by a 2020 McKinsey and Company report. In the same report, the total amount of wealth transitioning to women in the next decade is projected to exceed the annual GDP of the US, shifting women as the new face of wealth here in the US. As a result, women are increasingly taking proactive roles in shaping their economic destinies, which I thought, okay, that's pretty fascinating. And that is just, to me, another extremely compelling reason for these women that are poised to be in those positions to really learn about Bitcoin and how they might want to bring that into their financial planning. Yeah,
Yes. No,
yeah.
completely. I think that is the next big wave that's about to come into Bitcoin is women, and in particular millennial women. A lot of my peer group, they are really excelling in their careers. They're finally starting to come into salaries where they do want to make smarter decisions about how they invest for the future, or they make financial decisions for their families with their partners. And so it's critical that they learn about Bitcoin so that they can really plan and have the most financially secure future. Because I really think that the thing that is most broken in society today is the fact that people can't hold on to the value that they earn. They cannot save for the future. Most people in America, I'm sure people have heard the statistics. They can't afford a $1,000 emergency. The pandemic, I think, should wake everyone's eyes up to the fact that something happens it was supposed to be a 2-week shutdown, but even that 2-week shutdown sent every market closing. Every business was about to go out of business. Everyone needed to go into debt or get a stimulus check or get a grant from the government. We are a nation that is really built at this point on debt and credit, and no one has a form of savings that is truly the kind of capital that you can deploy for the future. It's really an IOU. Like we built our lives on credit cards and mortgages that for a young person today, how are they ever going to be able to afford and have the type of wages that can keep them afloat in a system that's all built on that?
I know it's a house of cards. It really is. And so unless you really start diving in and figuring out, okay, this is what the reality of the situation is now, not what the illusion is, but the reality, and how am I going to keep from getting this house of cards collapsing on me? It's a lot. Okay. I just love that you are really passionate about bringing women into the space for all of those reasons. And I can't wait to go to the Nashville event. Yes. Okay. Let's explain a little bit about the likelihood of CBDCs emerging. What do you want people to understand about that? Should they be wary? Is there going to be a way for people to avoid them? What exactly is that? What do they need to know?
Sure. So a CBDC is a central bank digital currency, and it has total control by the government. So you will have in the future, I think everyone in most nations will have a CBDC account that's maybe a mixture of, say, a retail bank that's also tied to the federal government. And that money, again, completely controlled by government actors. So they can decide to maybe stimulate the economy and put money in the checking account in the same way that they did with sending checks during the pandemic. Maybe they want you to start spending, but they could also put an expiration date on it. So you have to spend it by a certain time. So it de-incentivizes saving. If we enter into a situation where governments are more dystopian and authoritarian, we absolutely would empower through CBDCs a system where government actors could say, you cannot spend your money on certain things. There might be banned industries or companies or places where they absolutely will not allow you to essentially spend money. That's a scary world, right? We hope that things in our constitution will protect us from this. But again, billions of people live in authoritarian governments around the
Yeah.
world, and they will
Yeah.
not be able to protect themselves from something like this in a court of law. And then CBDCs also, I think the most important thing to understand is that they're the antithesis of Bitcoin. Bitcoin at its core is completely decentralized and completely scarce. There's a fixed supply, and you know that no one can just come in, manipulate it, influence the protocol, and debase what is your savings. But with a CBDC, they can just hit with the stroke of a key, a button, and make a bunch of more units as they've been essentially doing in our current system. So there are a lot of similarities to the system that we live in now, but it's going to force the consolidation of more retail banks, which, by the way, we've been seeing a lot of. We used to have a lot of regional banks, which were the backbone of the middle class and a lot of small businesses. We've seen them consolidate into fewer and fewer big banks that are ultimately wed to the government in many ways. And those are the banks that are going to help facilitate these CBDCs. So that's why I say that it's going to be some kind of combination of a retail bank account with the Federal Reserve or the federal account, because the two are so close and they're going to need each other for the deployment of this.
So you don't have the peace of mind, really, you would not have or will not have should that come to pass, and it likely will. But you won't have the peace of mind of knowing that no one can touch the value of what you have in the bank, because
Right.
because you won't have 100% sole control of it.
And people need to realize that we're moving more and more into a cashless society. So
Mhm.
in the future, 10, 20 years from now, these CBDCs, it's not like you're going to be able to go to a bank and just pull out the cash and somehow turn it into another asset. I mean, they can enact capital controls and they can prevent you from moving those funds into different rails or potentially withdrawing them at all. So that's another beautiful thing about Bitcoin, because it's completely outside of the system. It's something that they can never control. They cannot confiscate, they cannot seize, they cannot censor. And more, if governments do decide to implement these types of monetary programs that are very top down and centralized and controlled, more and more people will, I think, see the value of something that is the opposite of that really gives them that financial freedom and sovereignty and much less surveillance than exists in the current system. That's another point that I think many of us take for granted, we don't think about. Every transaction today that is digital has a middleman and has someone watching the transaction take place, monitoring it, and taking a cut. And
Right.
so we think that when we go to the coffee shop and tap our card to pay for our latte, that, oh, it seems like an easy exchange and they got the money. Actually, it will take weeks for banks, correspondence banks, to actually communicate with their ledgers to settle the account. And there's someone watching that transaction and knows you spent money on that coffee. And maybe that company can sell that data to another company that wants to sell you coffee ads. So the whole system right now,
Yeah.
it has a lot of disadvantages for the consumer, especially when it comes to privacy.
Yeah, yeah, it's very incestuous. So if you think you have 100% control and complete privacy right now, you are misguided. You
Yeah.
don't. And that will only intensify. Is is Bitcoin, so maybe you can spend a moment explaining a little bit about why Bitcoin is not a crypto. What is the difference? Because when you hear it all the time, people lump it all into the same category as cryptocurrency. So maybe you can just give a little explanation on why they are not the same.
Yes, the backbone is the same technology, cryptography, which relies on encryption. And for decades, people were trying to figure out how to do a peer-to-peer money system, like a cash-like system that was completely online, that could be decentralized. And many of the early experiments failed. And the genius of Satoshi Nakamoto is he put together a lot of different computer science experiments and projects together and added some layers of his own ingenuity to it. And he basically was able to create one that is truly capable of becoming decentralized, which it did. So let me break some of that down because it might sound a little bit confusing. Um, Today, we live in a system where there are ledgers that are controlled, right, by the third parties, intermediaries, nation states. If you bank at Chase or Wells Fargo, that is a ledger, and that is controlled by that bank. And that bank is connected to the central bank, the Federal Reserve, which is essentially the government ledger. And so all of these are controlled, centralized forces. And if they decided to just say to you, you know what, you can no longer bank with us, your money's no good here, they technically have the power to do that because they control the ledger. So how do you have a system where no one controls the ledger? What Satoshi Nakamoto did is he combined what's known as proof of work, which is a consensus mechanism where everyone can come to a consensus on what's essentially a block of transactions. The fact that I sent money to you, you sent it to John, John sent it to Harry, and all of these transactions come in and they're published on a ledger that all of us around the world can see. You can download the Bitcoin software and you can see all of these transactions in real time. Again, how do you know that your ledger is the same as Sarah's, is the same as Bob's across the world? And so you have to expend energy on these computations. That is what the proof of work is. So your computer, these miners around the world are essentially guessing very big numbers. It's like a lottery system. And if they guess a number that fits within the parameters of the code of the algorithm, then they are able to mine the block of transactions and add it to the ledger, and then it updates for everyone. And so all of us in real time have access to the same ledger. Not one person controls it. And it was able to become distributed around the entire world because anyone can run a node and essentially contribute to securing the network. What you have with the other cryptos that came afterwards is essentially a system where a small group of people, sometimes they even pre-mined coins that gave it to themselves before releasing the ledger to the world to mine. But in many cases, it's just a group of people or individuals or an organization or foundation who can control or change the ledger if enough of them want to manipulate, say, the supply or do something to the protocol. Bitcoin is the only one that has reached a sufficient amount of decentralization where that is extraordinarily difficult and cost prohibitive. You would need literally to harness the energy of multiple US navies in order to even try to hack the Bitcoin blockchain. And if you maybe succeeded for one block, the network could come in and toss that block aside and continue on with the appropriate blockchain. So it's because it was able to grow and grow organically from the bottom up that it has become sufficiently decentralized. Whereas everything that came afterward is sometimes a well-intentioned project, but ultimately is fallible to the fact that a small group of people could potentially influence it, or it doesn't have the proof of work mechanism that allows it to be a fair distributed system around the world and this open lottery for anyone to participate in. There's something called proof of stake, which essentially it mimics our current system where the more you have at stake, the more you get to mine or validate, which means that the more you have, the more you get to do and the more power you have. And you could potentially gain enough power to, I don't know, maybe in a couple of years, influence the network or what it does. Those sorts of technologies worry me because I want to be in a protocol that is extremely secure. And that security comes from the decentralization and the energy component that is so brilliant that Satoshi put together with something called the difficulty adjustment. And again, this is just like fun stuff that when you get into the weeds, I never thought that something computer science would be interesting to me. But the difficulty adjustment means that depending on how much computing power is on the Bitcoin network trying to mine and validate the blocks, the software actually regulates itself. It either slows down or not slows down, but makes it more or less difficult to mine Bitcoin based on the computing power so that you're assured to always have blocks that happen around the same amount of time. And so that you have that scarcity that is completely guaranteed, that fixed supply cannot be changed or manipulated. And I just find it so amazing that he took all these different technologies and innovations together and created a system that is so secure, so decentralized, and absolutely finite.
That's so interesting. I'm glad you mentioned that about the fixed supply because that is so key to this whole thing. Another main point that makes it completely different to what we've got going now, where there is no longer a fixed supply.
Mhm.
And so we just had the halving a few days ago. And if you want to maybe just spend a minute before we start to wrap up explaining to people why that's a good thing. What does that mean? And how does that relate to the fixed supply of Bitcoin?
Sure. At its simplest, what people need to know is that Bitcoin has a programmatic monetary policy. Everything is set in stone, it's baked into the code, and no one can change it because it's decentralized. Everyone on the network, or 51% of the people, would have to agree to a change. And at this point, because of its decentralization and its incentive system, it's near impossible to do that. I would say it's impossible. we live in a system that is not a programmatic monetary policy. There's a group of people in charge, and they can decide on any given day to change the supply, to change the interest rates. And so it's a very unpredictable, uncertain system. Bitcoin is completely predictable because the issuance schedule is known for the next 100 years. So instead of an inflationary system like the one we live in, where more and more units are created, Bitcoin is actually a disinflationary system where every 4 years, there are 4-year halving cycles. The amount of Bitcoin that are offered as a block subsidy or a block reward are cut in half. So we just had the fourth halving. It happened at block number 840,000 on Friday night, and the block subsidy was cut in half from 6.25 Bitcoin per block that's mined to 3.125. So every 4 years, that supply gets cut in half. It's a supply shock and a revenue shock for the miners when it happens. And generally about 12 to 18 months after a halving, it coincides with a new all-time high. This cycle is particularly interesting because we've never hit a new all-time high before the next halving. So things could get very interesting. History is not an indicator of guaranteed success or performance in the future, but I think that it would be difficult to see a situation where we don't hit a 6-figure Bitcoin during this halving cycle. Again, in the last halving cycle, the all-time high we hit was about $69,000 per Bitcoin. We've already hit that and exceeded that before this last halving. So I'm very bullish from here, but of course, you never know what can happen given the crazy macro environment that we find ourselves in.
I agree. It is exciting though. And I do, like you, I encourage people that want to at least put their toe in the water of this space to just, even if you think of it like a savings account and it's just a few dollars a week or a month. And I'm like you, I just automatically have an automatic thing monthly that buys X amount of dollars of Bitcoin. And it's just there. I forget we have it, right? Because I'm not trying to play the stock market where a lot of people are buying and selling and buying and selling, and they're trying to make money right now, because it's not that. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. You need to think about it as far as a little bit more long term, a little more security against all of the other craziness that we've been talking about. Natalie, I could go on for quite a while with you about this, and this has been very exciting and extremely informative. And I really appreciate how generous you've been with your time today. And I know that these are probably questions that you get all the time. So thank you for being so gracious with explaining a lot of this stuff to me and my audience. Where should people go to find out more about you and everything you're doing and what you have going on?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I really just want to help people really understand this space. And again, I know it can be intimidating. And even sometimes when I talk some of the technical components, I can't believe that I was able to learn it, because I had no computer science background or economics degree or something like that. Anyone can learn it. Anyone can understand this technology. It is as powerful of a transformation in terms of the ability to create and transfer value as I think the internet was in a different way and in a communication avenue. I think that this is the future of money, the internet of money. And so I want everyone to empower themselves. My show is called Coin Stories, and I have 2 episodes that release every single week. You can find it on Apple, Spotify, all your podcast platforms, as well as YouTube. I'm very active on X at Nat Brunell, and my website's talkingbitcoin.com. And I also have a free newsletter. It's a quick 5 to 10-minute read every week about the latest in Bitcoin and economic news for the average, just general mainstream audience. And that's at nataliebrunell.substack.com.
Awesome. And we'll make sure we put those links in the notes so everybody can easily find you. This has been delightful. Thank you so much, Natalie. And thanks everybody for listening. We will see you next time. Now, go buy some Bitcoin. Make some epic shifts happen in your own lives.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.